Settle in, as easy drift sleep guides you to peace. A soft reminder to like and subscribe, helping us share more moments of calm with you. The crisp, pine-scented air of the Black Hills, still cool with the lingering breath of dawn, carried the distant cry of a hawk, a solitary note in the vast, awakening wilderness. Below, nestled in a valley carved by time and water, the nascent town of Deadwood stirred, a rough-hewn jewel in the rugged crown of Dakota Territory. Smoke, thin and blue, began to curl from stovepipes, mingling with the persistent, gritty dust that already coated every surface, stirred by the first heavy wagons lumbering down the main street. The low hum of conversation, punctuated by the rhythmic clinking of a blacksmith's hammer and the occasional off-key chord from a saloon piano, began to weave the day's tapestry. Martha Jane Cannary, a figure as much a part of the landscape as the gnarled ponderosa pines, sat perched on a weathered barrel outside the Grand Central Hotel, her gaze sweeping over the scene with an almost proprietary air. Her buckskin jacket, softened by countless miles and countless nights under the stars, bore the marks of her chosen life, its fringes frayed, its leather darkened by sweat and dust. A wide-brimmed hat pulled low, shadowed eyes that had seen too much, what still held a spark of untamed curiosity, a glint of defiance. She chewed slowly on a piece of jerky, her movements economical, her posture relaxed yet alert, like a predator at rest. She was a woman of contradictions, a living legend in the making, her reputation preceding her like a dust cloud across the prairie. She had arrived in Deadwood with the first wave of prospectors, drawn by the siren song of gold and the promise of a life unburdened by the polite strictures of civilization. But her journey westward had begun long before the Black Hills gold rush, a migration that had etched itself into the very marrow of her bones. It was a story that started not with a bang, but with the slow, deliberate creak of wagon wheels, a rhythm that had become the heartbeat of her earliest memories. In the spring of 1864, when Martha Jane was a girl of 12, her family had packed their meager belongings into a canvas-covered wagon, leaving behind the settled farmlands of Missouri for the boundless, beckoning expanse of the American West. The journey had been a crucible, forging her spirit in the fires of hardship and loss. Her father, Robert, a man of quiet determination and calloused hands, had driven the team, his face set against the relentless sun and the unknown. Her mother, Charlotte, frail but resilient, had tended to Martha Jane and her 5 younger siblings, her voice a soft lullaby against the vast silence of the plains. Martha Jane remembered the endless horizon, a line that seemed to recede with every mile, promising something always just out of reach. She remembered the scent of wood smoke at twilight, the comforting aroma of coffee brewing over an open fire, and the shared warmth of blankets under a sky ablaze with more stars than she had ever imagined. But she also remembered the dust, thick and pervasive, coating their hair, their clothes, their very breath. She remembered the gnawing hunger that settled deep in her belly when game was scarce, and the chilling fear that gripped the wagon train when rumors of raiding parties swept through the camp. One sweltering afternoon, as the sun beat down with an oppressive intensity, her mother, already weakened by the journey, succumbed to the fever that had plagued the wagon train for days. Martha Jane, barely a teenager, watched with a child's bewildered grief as her mother's breath grew shallow, then ceased. The silence that followed was more profound than any she had ever known, a vast, echoing emptiness that swallowed the chirping of crickets and the distant lowing of cattle. They'd buried Charlotte by the trailside, under a solitary cottonwood tree, its leaves rustling a mournful elegy in the dry wind. Martha Jane had stood beside her father, his shoulders slumped, his eyes hollowed by sorrow, feeling the weight of the world settle upon her own young frame. The responsibility for her younger siblings, for the very survival of their small, broken family, seemed to transfer to her in that desolate moment. Just a year later, her father too passed away, leaving Martha Jane at 13, an orphan in a land that offered little pity. The world, which had once been a vast and exciting adventure, suddenly became a harsh, unforgiving taskmaster. She had to work, to provide, to survive. She took on any job she could find, dishwashing in frontier towns, cooking for railroad crews, even driving oxen teams, her small hands gripping the reins with a fierce determination. It was during these years, navigating the rough-and-tumble world of men, that she began to shed the soft skin of girlhood and don the tougher hide of a survivor. She learned to shoot with uncanny accuracy, to ride a horse like a Comanche warrior, and to swear with the colorful fluency of any seasoned teamster. She found that trousers were far more practical than skirts for riding and working, and that a gruff demeanor often kept unwanted attention at bay. The frontier, with its brutal honesty, had no patience for weakness, and Martha Jane, in turn, had no patience for pretense. She was shaping herself not out of vanity, but out of necessity, into the kind of woman who could not only endure, but thrive in this untamed land. The moniker Calamity Jane had attached itself to her sometime in the early 1870s, the exact origin shrouded in the mists of campfire tales and whiskey-fueled boasts. Some said she earned it protecting a group of soldiers from an ambush, declaring, "I'll bring calamity to anyone who harms these men." Others claimed it came from her own propensity for finding trouble, or perhaps being the cause of it. Whatever its true genesis, the name fit her like a second skin, a badge of honor in a world that respected grit above all else. It was a name that spoke of danger, of daring, of a woman who carved her own path with a rifle and a sharp wit. As she finished her jerky, tossing the bone to a scruffy dog that had materialized from the dust, Martha Jane's gaze drifted towards a small, unassuming building at the edge of town, its freshly painted sign proclaiming it a chapel of the Good Shepherd. A man stood outside, sweeping the dust from the small porch with slow, deliberate strokes. He was older, his hair a distinguished silver, his frame slender beneath a dark, worn suit. This was Reverend Henry Weston Smith, a man who seemed as out of place in Deadwood as a lily in a cactus patch. Reverend Smith had arrived in Deadwood just a few weeks prior, drawn by a fervent belief that even in the most lawless corners of the world, there were souls yearning for solace, for a guiding hand. He carried a worn Bible, its pages thumbed thin, and a quiet determination that belied his gentle demeanor. His eyes, kind and deep-set, held a profound sadness, as if he carried the burdens of every lost sheep he had ever encountered. He spoke softly, his voice a balm in the cacophony of the mining camp, and his sermons, delivered in the makeshift chapel, were simple, heartfelt pleas for compassion and understanding. Martha Jane had heard him preach once, more out of curiosity than conviction. She had sat in the back, her hat pulled low, listening to his words about forgiveness and redemption. They were foreign concepts in a town where justice was often meted out from the barrel of a gun, and where a man's past was rarely questioned, only his present intentions. Yet there was something in his voice, a genuine warmth that had resonated with a part of her she rarely acknowledged, a part that still remembered the lullabies of her mother, the simple prayers of her childhood. She watched him now, his movements methodical, almost meditative, as he swept the dust. He was a stark contrast to the boisterous, often violent population of Deadwood, a beacon of quiet faith in a sea of raw ambition and desperate hope. He sought to bring spiritual comfort to a place that seemed to thrive on its own wildness, to offer moral guidance where morality was often a luxury few could afford. He believed in the inherent good in people, even those whose lives were stained by desperation and sin, and he faced the indifference and cynicism of the frontier with a quiet, unwavering resolve. Martha Jane often wondered what drove a man like him to such a place. Was it a calling, a penance, or simply a profound, almost naive hope? She too had sought something in this untamed land. Freedom, yes, but also an identity, a place where she could define herself on her own terms, unbound by the expectations placed upon women in more settled societies. She had found a measure of that freedom, riding astride her horse, her rifle across her saddle, her own master. But with that freedom came a profound loneliness, a sense of being an outsider, even among those who admired her courage. The price of legend, she was beginning to understand, was often paid in solitude. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows that began to shrink as the day brightened. The main street of Deadwood, still muddy in places from a recent rain, was now a bustling thoroughfare. Wagons rattled past, their wheels churning the dust into fine, gritty clouds. Miners, their faces etched with the grime of the earth, spilled from saloons, their laughter mingling with the raucous shouts of card games. The scent of stale beer and cheap tobacco wafted from open doorways, competing with the more pleasant aroma of baking bread from the small general store. Martha Jane swung her leg over the barrel, her boots thudding softly on the plank sidewalk. She pulled her hat lower, a familiar gesture that both shielded her eyes and offered a subtle barrier to the world. She had a delivery to make, a message to carry to a mining camp up in the hills, a task that required her unique blend of fearlessness and knowledge of the treacherous trails. As she strode down the street, her spurs jingling softly, heads turned. Some nodded in respect, others in wary acknowledgement. She was Calamity Jane, a force of nature, a living testament to the wild spirit of the West. She passed the chapel, and for a moment her eyes met Reverend Smith's. He offered a small, gentle smile, a silent greeting that held no judgment, only a quiet understanding. Martha Jane, unaccustomed to such open kindness, offered a curt nod in return, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. The encounter was brief, a fleeting connection between two souls navigating the same harsh landscape, each seeking their own form of redemption, their own purpose, in a world that was rapidly changing, a frontier that was, even then, slowly beginning to vanish. The whispers of the untamed land, however, still echoed in the wind, carrying the stories of those who dared to live on its edges, shaping their own legends under the vast, indifferent sky. The trail to Deadwood had been long and unforgiving, a ribbon of dust unspooling across the vast, indifferent plains, then winding through the pine-scented canyons of the Black Hills. Martha Jane Cannary, astride her sturdy bay, felt the familiar ache in her bones, a testament to miles ridden and nights spent under the immense, star-dusted canvas of the Dakota sky. Her buckskin jacket, worn smooth in places, offered little protection against the biting wind that whipped around her, carrying the scent of pine and something else, something metallic and raw, the smell of ambition and newly turned earth. She had heard the whispers, the excited murmurs that had traveled faster than any stagecoach. Gold in the Black Hills, a town springing up overnight, a magnet for every fortune seeker, every gambler, every soul yearning for a fresh start or a quick fortune. Deadwood, they called it, a name that tasted of both promise and peril. As she rode into the burgeoning settlement, the cacophony assaulted her senses. The air, thick with sawdust and coal smoke, vibrated with the shouts of teamsters, the clang of hammers, the insistent braying of mules, and the distant, tinny music from a saloon. Tents and hastily constructed shacks clung to the steep hillsides like barnacles, while the main street, a churned-up river of mud and dust, teemed with humanity. Miners, their faces grimy with sweat and hope, jostled against smartly dressed gamblers, stoic Native Americans, and women of every description, their gazes ranging from wary to openly curious. Martha Jane, with her practical trousers, wide-brimmed hat, and Colt revolver holstered at her hip, drew her share of stares, but she met them with a steady, unflinching gaze that usually discouraged further scrutiny. She was a woman who knew how to make her own way, and Deadwood, for all its chaos, felt like a place where such a spirit might thrive, or at least survive. She dismounted near a livery stable, the familiar creak of saddle leather, a comforting sound in the overwhelming din. As she led her horse inside, the stable hand, a young man with wide, innocent eyes, barely glanced at her, too preoccupied with the endless stream of incoming animals. Martha Jane found a stall, rubbed down her horse with practiced hands, and then, leaving the animal to its feed, stepped back out into the heart of the town. Her intention was to find a place to lay her head, perhaps a meal that didn't consist of dried jerky, and then to gauge the lay of the land. She had no specific plan, only the restless urge that always propelled her forward, a yearning for freedom that no single place could ever truly satisfy. As she walked, her boots sinking slightly into the thick dust, her eyes scanned the faces, the storefronts, the endless procession of life unfolding around her. She noticed a group gathered near the general store. Their heads turned towards a figure who stood a little apart, leaning casually against a hitching post. Even from a distance, there was something about him that commanded attention, a quiet authority that seemed to cut through the surrounding clamor. He was tall, his frame lean and elegant, and his long, light hair, almost silver in the afternoon sun, flowed down to his shoulders, contrasting sharply with the dark, neatly trimmed moustache that framed his mouth. He wore a dark frock coat, a crisp white shirt, and a wide-brimmed hat that cast shadows over his face. But even so, Martha Jane could discern the piercing blue eyes that seemed to miss nothing. It was him, James Butler Hickok, Wild Bill. His name, like hers, was already a whisper on the wind, a legend in its own right, though his tales were often of quick draws and unwavering courage, of law and order imposed with a steady hand and a deadly aim. Martha Jane had heard the stories, of course. Everyone had. She had even seen him once before, briefly, in another dusty town, a fleeting glimpse of the man behind the myth. But here in the raw, untamed heart of Deadwood, he seemed to embody the very spirit of the place, a figure carved from the same rugged landscape. She found herself drawn closer, not out of any particular purpose, but simply out of an instinct to observe, to understand. She watched as a man, loud and belligerent, stumbled out of the saloon across the street, shouting obscenities. Wild Bill, without so much as a flicker of expression, simply shifted his weight, his hand moving almost imperceptibly towards the pearl handles of the two revolvers holstered at his hips. The belligerent man, catching sight of that subtle movement, seemed to deflate, his bluster evaporating like mist in the morning sun. He muttered something incoherent and then scuttled away, disappearing into the crowd. Wild Bill remained still, his gaze sweeping the street, a silent sentinel. Martha Jane felt a strange kinship with him, an unspoken recognition of two souls who lived on the fringes, who navigated a world that was often hostile, often unforgiving. She understood the weight of a reputation, the constant scrutiny, the way a name could precede you, shaping perceptions before a single word was spoken. She understood the loneliness that often accompanied such a life, the necessity of maintaining a certain distance, a certain guardedness. Their eyes met then, across the dusty street, a brief, silent acknowledgement. His gaze, though weary, held a depth that hinted at experiences beyond imagining, a quiet understanding. Martha Jane felt a peculiar warmth spread through her chest, a sense of being seen, truly seen by someone who might actually comprehend the complexities of her own existence. There was no flirtation in his look, no judgment, only a recognition of a kindred spirit. He offered a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture that spoke volumes without uttering a single sound. She returned it, a small private moment shared amidst the roiling chaos of Deadwood. Then, as quickly as it had come, the moment passed. He turned, his gaze once again sweeping the street, and Martha Jane continued her walk, a new subtle current running beneath her usual restlessness. The encounter was brief, a fleeting connection between two souls navigating the same harsh landscape, each seeking their own form of redemption, their own purpose, in a world that was rapidly changing, a frontier that was, even then, slowly beginning to vanish. The whispers of the untamed land, however, still echoed in the wind, carrying the stories of those who dared to live on its edges, shaping their own legends under the vast, indifferent sky. Days bled into weeks, and Martha Jane settled into the rhythm of Deadwood, a rhythm dictated by the gold dust that flowed through its veins. She worked odd jobs, scouted for wagon trains, and sometimes, when the mood struck her, she'd regale a saloon full of thirsty miners with exaggerated tales of her adventures, embellishing facts with a storyteller's flair, crafting the legend of Calamity Jane with every boisterous laugh and every wide-eyed stare she elicited. She found a sort of rough camaraderie in the saloons, a place where her unconventional appearance was less a curiosity and more an accepted eccentricity. She often saw Wild Bill, sometimes at the poker tables, sometimes simply walking the street, his presence a quiet anchor in the town's swirling currents. Their interactions remained minimal, respectful nods, a shared glance, an unspoken acknowledgement of their respective places in the evolving tapestry of the West. Then, the whispers began to change. They were no longer of gold strikes and fortunes made, but of a different kind of contagion, a sickness that arrived with the new waves of prospectors, carried on the very breath of ambition. It started subtly, a cough here, a fever there, dismissed at first as the common ailments of frontier life. But soon, the symptoms grew unmistakable, the characteristic rash appearing on faces, the high fevers leaving victims delirious and weak. Smallpox. The word itself was a chilling pronouncement, a death knell echoing through the narrow canyons of Deadwood. Panic, a far more virulent contagion than the disease itself, began to spread. The town, built on the fragile foundations of greed and hope, was ill-equipped to handle such a crisis. Doctors were few, medicines scarcer, and the prevailing instinct was to flee, to abandon the afflicted to their fate. Martha Jane watched with a growing sense of dread and a familiar surge of indignation. She had seen suffering before, had nursed the sick on countless trails and in desolate camps. Her rough exterior, her sharp tongue, often masked a deep well of compassion, a fierce protective instinct for the vulnerable. She saw the fear in people's eyes, the way they recoiled from those who showed the first signs of illness. She saw families torn apart, the healthy abandoning the sick, leaving them to languish in their tents or shacks, alone and terrified. It was a stark reminder of the brutal realities of the frontier, where self-preservation often trumped all other instincts. But for Martha Jane, it was also a call to action. One evening, as the shadows lengthened and the chill of the Black Hills night began to creep in, she found herself walking past a small, dilapidated cabin on the outskirts of town. A low moan, thin and desperate, drifted from within. She hesitated for only a moment, then pushed open the rickety door. Inside, huddled on a straw mattress, lay a young woman, her face flushed, her skin already erupting in angry pustules, her eyes, wide with terror, fixed on Martha Jane. It was one of Dora Dufran's girls, a young woman named Lily, known for her bright laugh and quick wit, now reduced to a shivering, feverish wreck. Martha Jane felt a familiar tightening in her chest, a mixture of anger at the injustice of it all and a resolute determination to act. She knew the risks, understood the contagious nature of the disease, but the sight of such raw suffering was something she could never turn away from. She went to Dora Dufran's establishment, a two-story building that, despite the town's chaos, always seemed to exude an air of quiet order. Dora, a woman of formidable presence, with shrewd eyes and a surprisingly gentle smile, met her at the door. "Lily's sick," Martha Jane stated, her voice gruff, devoid of its usual swagger. "Smallpox. She's alone." Dora's face, usually composed, showed a flicker of concern. She was a businesswoman, pragmatic and tough, but she also held a fierce loyalty to her girls. "I sent for a doctor," she said, her voice low, "but he wouldn't come. Said he couldn't risk it." "Then I'll do it," Martha Jane declared, her jaw set. "Someone has to." Dora studied her for a long moment, her gaze penetrating. She knew Martha Jane's reputation, the wild stories, the hard living. But she also recognized the unwavering resolve in her eyes. "You understand the danger, Calamity?" she asked, using the nickname that had already begun to stick. "I understand," Martha Jane replied, her voice steady. "I've seen worse." And so began Martha Jane's tireless vigil. She moved into the cabin with Lily, isolating herself from the rest of the town. She boiled water, changed soiled linens, and fashioned cool compresses for Lily's burning forehead. She spoke in soft, soothing tones, telling stories of the open plains, of sunsets over distant mountains, of the resilience of the human spirit, trying to distract the young woman from her pain and fear. She cleaned the cabin with a ferocity that belied her gentle ministrations, scrubbing surfaces, airing out the room, doing everything she could to fight the invisible enemy. Word of her selfless actions spread through Deadwood like wildfire, a stark contrast to the fear and abandonment that gripped the town. People, initially wary, began to look at her differently. The rough-and-tumble scout, the hard-drinking storyteller, was revealing a side of herself that few had ever witnessed. It was a quiet heroism, devoid of gunfights or grand pronouncements, but no less profound. Reverend Henry Weston Smith, the town's earnest preacher, a man with kind eyes and a worn Bible, was one of the first to offer practical help. He brought food, clean water, and what few medicinal herbs he could gather, leaving them on the porch, maintaining a respectful distance. He would stand outside the cabin, his voice soft but clear, reading passages from his Bible, offering prayers for the sick and for the brave woman who tended them. Martha Jane, though not overtly religious, found a strange comfort in his quiet devotion, in the steady rhythm of his words. His presence, a beacon of unwavering faith in a town consumed by fear, was a quiet testament to the enduring power of compassion.
As the epidemic worsened, Martha Jane's efforts expanded beyond Lily. She moved from cabin to cabin, from tent to tent, wherever she heard the desperate cries of the sick. She nursed miners, gamblers, and more of Dora's girls, her hands usually accustomed to reins and firearms, now gentle and steady as she tended to fevered brows and aching limbs. She learned to mix poultices, to administer what little medicine was available, and most importantly, to offer comfort and hope where there was only despair.
She saw the raw humanity in each suffering face, the fear of death, the yearning for a gentle touch. One afternoon, she found herself at the bedside of a burly miner, his body racked with tremors, his breathing shallow. He had been a loud, boisterous man, quick to anger, but now he was reduced to a whimpering child. As she wiped his brow, he looked up at her, his eyes glazed with fever, and whispered, "Thank you, ma'am." No one else would. Martha Jane simply nodded, her throat tight. It was in these moments, in the quiet intimacy of suffering, that she felt most truly herself, most truly alive, her purpose clear and undeniable. Dora Dufran, ever the pragmatist, organized a collection among the town's more prosperous citizens, gathering funds for supplies and food for the sick. She watched Martha Jane with a growing respect, recognizing the depth of character beneath the buckskins and the bluster. "You're a force of nature, Calamity," she remarked one day, leaving a basket of fresh bread and a bottle of whiskey on the cabin porch.
A strange kind of angel, but an angel nonetheless.
Martha Jane just grunted, accepting the whiskey with a grateful nod, knowing it would be used to sterilize instruments, not to drink. Even Wild Bill Hickok, usually aloof and reserved, acknowledged her efforts. He would sometimes ride past the cabins where she tended the sick, his gaze lingering for a moment, a silent message of respect passing between them. He understood the courage it took. Not the courage of a gunfight, but the quiet, relentless bravery of facing down an invisible enemy, of choosing compassion in the face of overwhelming fear. He saw the toll it took on her, the dark circles under her eyes, the weariness that settled deep in her bones, but also the unwavering light that still burned within her. The smallpox epidemic eventually began to wane, leaving behind a trail of grief and loss, but also a profound shift in the collective consciousness of Deadwood. The town had faced its mortality, and in doing so, had witnessed the extraordinary compassion of one of its most unlikely residents. Martha Jane, though physically exhausted, felt a quiet satisfaction. She had faced down fear, had offered solace, and in doing so, had found a deeper connection to the community, a sense of belonging she had rarely experienced. She was no longer just a scout, a storyteller, a wild woman of the plains. She was Calamity Jane, the woman who had nursed Deadwood through its darkest hour, a legend forged not in the heat of a gunfight, but in the quiet, compassionate acts of a truly remarkable heart.
The dust of Deadwood still swirled, the saloons still roared, but something fundamental had changed, both within the town and within Martha Jane herself. She had shown them, and perhaps more importantly, she had shown herself, the true measure of her own strength, the unwavering depth of her own humanity. Yet even as the fever broke, and the town slowly exhaled its collective sigh of relief, a different kind of tension began to coil through the narrow, crowded streets. A subtle shift in the air that spoke less of illness and more of an underlying, persistent unease. It was the kind of feeling that often settled over a place like Deadwood, a town built on the shifting sands of fortune and desperation, where every smile held a shadow and every handshake concealed a secret. Martha Jane, having shed the nurse's apron for her familiar buckskins, found herself drawn back to the chaotic pulse of the main street. Though her steps now carried a different cadence, less hurried, more observant. She saw the faces of men who had been at death's door just weeks before, now laughing boisterously over a game of faro, their voices still a little hoarse, their eyes still holding a memory of fear. She saw Dora Dufran, impeccably dressed as always, overseeing the comings and goings at her establishment with an air of quiet authority, her sharp gaze missing nothing. Dora had been a rock during the epidemic, her practical kindness a steadying force,
and Martha Jane felt a burgeoning respect for the madam, a woman who navigated the treacherous currents of Deadwood with such unflappable grace. One afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in hues of fiery orange and deep violet, Martha Jane found herself leaning against the rough-hewn facade of the Nuttall and Mann's saloon, the scent of stale beer and sawdust mingling with the crisp pine air. Her gaze, restless as ever, swept over the familiar tableau of the street, pausing on a figure seated at a poker table near the front window. It was Jane's butler Hickok, Wild Bill, his back to the door, his long hair falling over the collar of his dark coat. He held a hand of cards with an almost languid grace, his movements economical, his famous piercing blue eyes, though unseen from her vantage point, undoubtedly fixed on the green felt. A peculiar weight settled in Martha Jane's chest as she watched him. Bill had arrived in Deadwood not long after her, drawn by the siren song of gold and the persistent whisper of his own legend. He had been a familiar, if somewhat distant presence during the epidemic, offering a quiet word of encouragement to those who needed it, his very presence a testament to the enduring spirit of the frontier. Yet, there was a weariness about him now, a subtle slump to his shoulders that spoke of battles fought and victories that felt less like triumphs and more like burdens. His eyesight, she knew, was failing, a cruel irony for a man whose reputation rested so heavily on his unerring aim. He was a legend trapped in a body that was beginning to betray him, a king without a kingdom, perpetually pursued by the ghosts of his past and the expectations of his present. Martha Jane remembered their first meeting, years ago, a fleeting encounter that had nonetheless left an indelible mark. She had always felt a kinship with Bill, a shared understanding of what it meant to live on the fringes, to carve out an identity in a world that constantly sought to define and confine. She admired his quiet strength, his unwavering courage, and the deep, almost melancholic solitude that seemed to cling to him like a second skin. She had often claimed a romantic attachment to him, a grand, sweeping narrative that suited her own larger-than-life persona, but the truth was more nuanced, a complex tapestry of admiration, empathy, and a profound sense of recognition. They were two wild creatures, both untamed, both seeking a freedom that always seemed just beyond their grasp. As the light faded, the interior of the saloon began to glow with the warm, flickering light of oil lamps, casting long, dancing shadows across the rough-hewn walls. The clinking of glasses, the murmur of voices, the occasional burst of raucous laughter, all the familiar sounds of Deadwood's evening life began to swell. Martha Jane pushed herself off the wall, a sudden, inexplicable urge to be closer to Bill pulling her forward. She wanted to see his face, to catch his eye, to simply share the same air, if only for a moment. She walked slowly, deliberately, her boots making soft scuffs on the dusty plank sidewalk, the chill of the evening air beginning to bite. Just as she reached the swinging doors of the saloon, a movement caught her eye. A man, burly and unkempt, with a shifty glint in his eyes, slipped past her, his gaze fixed on the back of Wild Bill Hickok's head. Martha Jane felt a prickle of alarm, a primal instinct honed by years of living on the edge. There was something predatory in the man's posture, something deeply unsettling in the way he moved, like a wolf stalking its prey. Her hand instinctively went to the pistol at her hip, her fingers brushing the cold metal. But before she could fully process the burgeoning threat, before she could even utter a warning, a sharp, deafening crack ripped through the air. The sound was shockingly loud in the enclosed space, reverberating off the wooden walls and momentarily silencing the boisterous saloon. It was a sound that Martha Jane knew intimately, the sound of a pistol shot. But this one was different, sharper, more final. A collective gasp rippled through the room, followed by a stunned, terrifying silence. Martha Jane's blood ran cold. Her heart leaped into her throat, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Her eyes, wide with a sudden dawning horror, darted to the poker table. Wild Bill Hickok, who had been holding his cards just moments before, now slumped forward, his head hitting the green felt with a sickening thud. A dark crimson stain began to bloom on the back of his coat, spreading rapidly, impossibly fast. His cards, a pair of aces and a pair of eights, lay scattered on the table, a silent testament to the hand he had been dealt, a hand that would forever be etched into the grim folklore of the West. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, the vibrant, chaotic energy of the saloon drained away, replaced by a chilling stillness. Martha Jane felt a wave of nausea wash over her breath catching in her throat. The man who had fired the shot stood frozen for a split second, the smoking pistol still clutched in his hand, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and a strange, almost vacant triumph. Then, as if a spell had been broken, the saloon erupted into a cacophony of shouts, screams, and the frantic scraping of chairs. Martha Jane pushed through the sudden surge of panicked bodies, her eyes fixed on Bill's motionless form. Her mind raced, a whirlwind of disbelief and profound grief. Not like this, she thought. Not for him, not for the legend, not for the man who had faced down so many dangers with such unwavering courage. He deserved a hero's death, a blaze of glory, not this cowardly, ignominious end. The injustice of it all was a bitter taste in her mouth. She reached the table, her hands trembling as she gently touched his shoulder. His skin was already cooling, the warmth of life rapidly receding. His long hair, usually so meticulously kept, was disheveled, falling across his pale face. His eyes, those piercing blue eyes that had seen so much, were now closed, forever still. A single tear, hot and stinging, traced a path down Martha Jane's dusty cheek. It was not just for Bill, though her sorrow for him was immense, but for the vanishing frontier he represented, for the wild, untamed spirit that was slowly, inevitably, being extinguished. Dora Dufran, her face pale, but her expression resolute, appeared at Martha Jane's side, her arms slipping around her waist in a gesture of quiet support. "Oh, Martha Jane," Dora whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Poor, poor Bill." Dora's eyes, usually so sharp and calculating, were now clouded with a deep, almost maternal sadness. Had seen the toll his reputation had taken on him, the way the weight of his own legend had slowly crushed the man beneath. She understood the cruel irony of his death, the way it cemented his myth, even as it extinguished his life. Martha Jane could only nod, unable to speak, her throat tight with unshed tears. The saloon, once a place of raucous revelry, was now a scene of somber chaos. Men stood in stunned silence, their faces etched with disbelief, some openly weeping. The killer, quickly apprehended, was being dragged away, his protests muffled by the angry shouts of the crowd. But Martha Jane barely registered it. Her world had narrowed to the still figure of Wild Bill Hickok, to the quiet tragedy unfolding before her eyes. She remembered his words, spoken just days before, about his failing eyesight, about his weariness, about his yearning for a simpler life, a life away from the constant threat of violence. He had sought peace, but it had found him in death, a final, brutal irony. The weight of his legend had been too heavy, the relentless pursuit of his past too strong. He had been a man caught between two worlds, the wild, lawless frontier and the encroaching order of civilization. And in the end, neither could save him. Martha Jane knelt beside him, her hand resting gently on his bloodied coat. She felt a profound sense of loneliness, a chilling realization that a piece of her own wild, untamed spirit had died with him. They were kindred souls, Both outsiders, both legends in their own right. And now one of them was gone, leaving an unfillable void. The West was changing, she knew, and Bill's death was a stark, brutal reminder of that inevitable transformation. The era of the lone gunfighter, the fearless scout, the untamed spirit, was slowly fading, replaced by fences, laws, and the relentless march of progress. The air in the saloon grew heavy, thick with unspoken grief and the lingering scent of gunpowder. The flickering lamplight cast long, mournful shadows, making the scene feel like a painting, a grim tableau of frontier life. Martha Jane closed her eyes for a moment, picturing Bill as he had been, vibrant and alive. His eyes sparkling with a mischievous glint, his voice calm and steady. She remembered the stories he had told, the quiet moments they had shared, the unspoken understanding that had existed between them. When she opened her eyes, Dora was still there, her hand a comforting weight on Martha Jane's shoulder. "He's at peace now, Martha Jane," Dora said softly, her voice a balm in the raw wound of Martha Jane's grief. No more looking over his shoulder, no more fighting the ghosts. Martha Jane nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on Bill's still face. Dora was right. The constant burden of his reputation, the perpetual threat of violence, the endless cycle of expectation and confrontation, all of it was over. He had found his quiet, albeit tragic peace. But for those left behind, for Martha Jane, the silence he left in his wake was deafening, a stark reminder of the fragile line between life and legend, between freedom and its ultimate cost. She stood slowly, her body aching with a profound weariness that had nothing to do with physical exertion. The room, once a blur of chaotic grief, now began to resolve into individual faces, each one reflecting a different shade of shock and sorrow. The piano player, who had been mid-tune when the shot rang out, now sat slumped on his stool, his hands resting limply on the keys, the silence of the instrument a poignant counterpoint to the tragedy. Martha Jane turned away from the table, her heart heavy, her mind already beginning to weave the threads of this grim event into the larger tapestry of her own life, into the legend that was Calamity Jane. She knew that Bill's death would become another story, another piece of the myth of the West, recounted around countless campfires and in countless saloons. And she, Martha Jane, would be there to tell it, to ensure that his memory, and the memory of the wild, untamed spirit he embodied, would live on, even as the frontier itself slowly faded into the pages of history. The night had fallen completely now, a dark, star-studded blanket draped over Deadwood, a town that had just witnessed the brutal, inevitable price of legend, a town that would never quite be the same. The night that swallowed Wild Bill Hickok also swallowed a piece of Martha Jane, leaving behind a hollow echo where her boisterous spirit once resided. The raw, jagged grief tore through her like a winter wind across the plains, leaving her exposed and shivering. She had always been a woman of motion, her life a constant gallop across the frontier. But now her movements were less purposeful, more a desperate flight from the silence that had fallen over her heart. The familiar clamor of Deadwood, once a comforting symphony of life, now grated on her nerves, each laugh, each clinking glass, a painful reminder of the laughter and camaraderie she had lost. She tried to stay, for a time, haunting the edges of the saloons where she had once held court, her eyes scanning faces for a flicker of the past, but finding only pity or a cautious distance. The buckskins that had once felt like a second skin now chafed, and the weight of her rifle, once a source of comfort, now felt like an unbearable burden. The whiskey, which had always been a companion, became a cruel master, dulling the edges of her sorrow, only to sharpen them again with each sober dawn. She would sit for hours, staring into the flickering flame of a lantern, the faces of those she had lost, her parents, her siblings, and now Bill, swirling in the smoke, their laughter and their final breaths mingling in a suffocating haze. One particularly bleak morning, as the first grey light bled over the jagged peaks surrounding Deadwood, painting the pines in shades of indigo and slate, Martha Jane found herself on the outskirts of town, her horse, an old, reliable mare named Dolly, patiently waiting. The air was sharp and cold, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth, a scent that usually invigorated her, but today only deepened the ache in her chest. She looked back at the cluster of wooden buildings, the smoke already curling from a few chimneys, and felt an unfamiliar sense of profound detachment. This place, which had promised so much, now offered only ghosts. With a heavy sigh that seemed to carry the weight of all her unspoken sorrows, she swung herself into the saddle, the familiar creak of the leather a small comfort in the vast silence. She didn't have a destination, not really, just a primal urge to put distance between herself and the memories that clung to Deadwood like burrs. She rode north, then west, letting Dolly pick her way through the winding trails, past stands of ponderosa pine, his needles whispered secrets in the breeze, and across meadows still damp with dew. The vastness of the Black Hills, usually a source of exhilarating freedom, now felt like an endless, echoing chamber for her grief. She was a solitary figure against a backdrop of immense, indifferent beauty, a small, lost soul adrift in a world too large for her pain, marked only by the shifting patterns of the sun and stars, the changing phases of the moon. She hunted for her food, slept under the open sky, and spoke only to Dolly, her voice a rough murmur against the vast quiet. She found herself revisiting old haunts, places where she had scouted, places where she had laughed with companions long gone. Each familiar landmark, a particular rock formation, a gnarled old tree, a hidden spring, brought a fresh wave of memory, a bittersweet pang of what once was. She saw the ghost of her younger self, full of fire and untamed spirit, riding fearlessly into the unknown, and she wondered where that girl had gone, if she could ever be found again, beneath the layers of sorrow and disillusionment. One evening, as a cold, persistent rain began to fall, turning the forest floor into a slick, dark expanse, Martha Jane found herself seeking shelter in a forgotten trapper's cabin, its roof sagging, its single window long since shuttered. The air inside was thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying wood. She built a small fire in the crumbling hearth, watching the flames dance, their warmth a fragile shield against the encroaching chill. As the rain drummed a relentless rhythm on the decaying roof, she pulled out a worn photograph from her buckskin pouch, a faded image of Bill, his eyes piercing, a faint, knowing smile playing on his lips. She traced the outline of his face with a calloused finger, a tear finally escaping, tracing a hot path down her weather-beaten cheek. The loneliness was a physical ache, a gnawing emptiness that no amount of whiskey or wandering could fill. She longed for connection, for a hand to hold, for a voice to share the vast silence with, but the wilderness offered only its own stoic companionship. Eventually, the raw edges of her grief began to soften, not to disappear, but to recede into a more manageable ache, like a wound that had finally begun to scar over. The relentless wandering had quieted the loudest screams of her heart, replacing them with a dull throb. She still carried the weight of her losses, but she also carried the resilience that had always been her truest companion. The frontiers had taught her how to survive, how to endure, and even in her deepest despair, that lesson remained etched into her very being. It was this quiet, persistent resilience that eventually led her back towards the fringes of civilization. Not to Deadwood, not yet, but to the small, dusty settlements that dotted the plains. She sought work, taking on whatever odd jobs she could find, washing dishes in a boarding house, mending clothes for miners, even driving a stagecoach for a short, exhilarating stint. She still wore her buckskins, still rode astride, but there was a new quietness about her, a watchful stillness that belied the fire that still flickered within.
It was during this period of quiet rebuilding, somewhere in the vast, shifting landscape of the plains, that Martha Jane encountered a man named Clinton Burke. He was a quiet, unassuming teamster, his hands calloused from years of handling reins and heavy loads, his eyes kind, if a little weary. He offered her a steady job, driving a freight wagon across the desolate stretches between towns, and in the shared solitude of the long journeys, a hesitant companionship began to bloom. He saw past the rough exterior, past the reputation, to the tender, wounded heart beneath, and he offered her a quiet, uncomplicated affection that she hadn't realized she craved. Their courtship was not one of grand gestures or passionate declarations, but of shared silences under vast, star-strewn skies, of practical kindnesses, of the slow, steady rhythm of two solitary souls finding a tentative comfort in each other's presence. He didn't try to change her, didn't try to tame her wild spirit, but simply accepted her, scars and all. For a brief, tender period, Martha Jane allowed herself to imagine a different kind of life, one rooted, perhaps, in the quiet domesticity she had always fled. They married, a simple affair in a dusty courthouse, and for a fleeting time, Martha Jane found herself embracing a role she had never envisioned. She tried to settle, to build a home, to find contentment in the small, everyday rhythms of a conventional life. And then, a new life began to stir within her, a tiny, fragile hope blooming in the midst of her still tender heart. She was to be a mother. The news brought with it a complex tapestry of emotions, a profound, almost terrifying tenderness, a fierce protectiveness, and an unsettling tremor of fear. How could a woman like her, a woman who had lived a life of constant motion and danger, ever provide the stability and safety a child deserved? The thought of holding a tiny, helpless being in her arms filled her with a love so potent it almost buckled her knees. But it also brought a wave of anxiety, a stark realization of the constraints that motherhood would inevitably impose upon her fiercely independent spirit. Her daughter, Jessie, was born in the quiet solitude of a small rented room. Her cries a fragile melody in the vast silence of the plains. Martha Jane held her close, marveling at the tiny fingers, the soft downy hair, the innocent gaze that seemed to hold all the promise of a future she couldn't quite grasp. In those early days, she experienced a profound, almost overwhelming joy, a sense of purpose that transcended all her previous adventures. She would spend hours simply watching Jessie sleep, her heart swelling with a love so fierce it felt like a physical ache. But the domestic life, the four walls of a small cabin, the endless cycle of feeding and comforting, began to chafe. The wildness that was so deeply ingrained in her nature, the restless spirit that had always driven her across vast distances, began to stir once more. She found herself staring out the window, her gaze sweeping across the endless horizon, a longing for the open road, for the wind in her hair, for the untamed freedom of the wilderness, growing stronger with each passing day. The quiet life, while offering a tender solace, also felt like a cage, slowly closing in around her. She tried, she truly did, to reconcile the two Martha Janes, the devoted mother and the untamed frontierswoman. She tried to teach Jessie about the world beyond their cabin, pointing out the different birds, telling her stories of the mountains and the rivers, but the words felt hollow, a pale imitation of the life she truly yearned to live. The conflict within her was a constant low hum, a bittersweet melody of love and longing. It was Dora Dufran who offered a different perspective, a practical, unsentimental understanding of Martha Jane's predicament. Martha Jane had found her way back to Deadwood, drawn by an invisible thread, though she rarely lingered long in the bustling main street. She would often seek out Dora's establishment, not for the revelry, but for the quiet, knowing company of the madam. Dora's house, with its plush velvet, the scent of expensive perfume, and the low hum of conversation, offered a strange kind of sanctuary, a place where the harsh realities of the frontier were softened, if only for a few hours. As the golden light of the setting sun streamed through the lace curtains of Dora's private parlor, casting long, dancing shadows across the patterned carpet, Martha Jane sat across from Dora, a cup of strong black coffee steaming between her hands. Jessie, a toddler now, was playing quietly in a corner, absorbed in a pile of colorful ribbons Dora had given her. "You look like a woman caught between two worlds, Martha Jane," Dora observed, her voice low and empathetic, her shrewd eyes missing nothing. She wore a gown of deep emerald green, its fabric shimmering softly in the fading light, and her hands, adorned with several rings, rested gracefully on her lap. The room smelled faintly of rosewater and polished wood, a stark contrast to the dusty trails Martha Jane had traversed. Martha Jane sighed, a deep, weary sound. "I am Dora. I love that little one more than life itself. But this settled life, it's like trying to hold a wild Mustang in a small pen. It just ain't natural for me." She gestured vaguely towards the window, where the distant peaks of the Black Hills stood silhouetted against the deepening twilight. "My heart aches for the open country, for the freedom of it all. But then I look at Jessie, and my heart aches for her too, for a life I can't seem to give her." Dora nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "Some women are meant for hearth and home, Martha Jane, and some are meant for the wide open spaces. Neither is better, just different. And a child, a little one like Jessie, needs stability, a constant hand, a safe harbor." She paused, her gaze softening as she looked at the little girl. "You know, there are good people, kind people, who can provide that kind of upbringing. A gentle hand, a steady roof, while still knowing who her mother is, and that her mother loves her fiercely." Martha Jane's gaze snapped back to Dora, a flicker of understanding, and then a fresh wave of pain washing over her face. The unspoken suggestion hung in the air, heavy and profound. To give up her daughter, even for her daughter's own good, felt like tearing a piece of her soul away. Yet the truth of Dora's words resonated deep within her. She knew, with a painful clarity, that her restless spirit, her unpredictable life, was not the steady foundation a child needed. She was a whirlwind, a force of nature, and a child needed calm, a gentle breeze, not a constant storm. The decision, when it finally came, was perhaps the hardest she ever made. Harder than any gunfight, any blizzard, any desperate ride. It was a decision born of a profound, selfless love, a love that understood its own limitations. She arranged for Jessie to be cared for by a kind family, a family who could offer the stability, the schooling, the quiet domesticity that Martha Jane, in her heart of hearts, knew she could not provide. It was a bittersweet parting, filled with unspoken promises and silent tears. She held Jessie close, breathing in the scent of her hair, memorizing the feel of her tiny hand in hers, knowing that this was a sacrifice made for love, a different kind of love than she had ever known. With Jessie settled, a profound emptiness settled in Martha Jane's heart, but also a strange, quiet sense of release. The constraints were gone, but so too was the constant, tender presence of her child. She was free again, free to roam, free to be the Martha Jane Cannary of legend. But the freedom felt different now, tinged with a deep, abiding melancholy. The wilderness, her old companion,
beckoned once more, but it no longer felt like an escape. It felt like a destiny, a path she was fated to walk alone. Her unique legacy forged in the crucible of both fierce independence and profound, quiet sorrow. She returned to the trails, to the dusty roads, to the rough-and-tumble life of the frontier, but she carried Jessie in her heart, a constant tender ache, a reminder of the path not taken, the life she had chosen to forego for the sake of her child. Her wanderings continued, her reputation growing, her stories weaving themselves into the fabric of the West. But beneath the buckskins and the bluster, a quiet, reflective woman emerged, one who understood the true cost of freedom, the bittersweet price of legend, and the enduring echoes of a love that transcended distance and circumstance. The vast star-filled sky above the plains, once a canvas for her adventures, now seemed to hold the silent whispers of her past, a testament to a life lived on her own terms, fiercely, bravely, and with a heart that carried the weight of both its wildness and its tender, enduring love. The vast, star-filled sky above the plains, once a canvas for her adventures, now seemed to hold the silent whispers of her past, a testament to a life lived on her own terms, fiercely, bravely, and with a heart that carried the weight of both its wildness and its tender, enduring love. Years drifted by like tumbleweeds across the prairie, each one carrying Martha Jane further from the raw, untamed frontier she had known, further from the days when every sunrise promised a new, unwritten adventure. The West, once an endless expanse of possibility, was slowly being tamed, fenced, and settled, its wild spirit diminishing with each passing train and telegraph wire. Martha Jane, too, felt the subtle shift within herself, a weariness that settled deep in her bones, not of body, but of spirit, a longing for something she couldn't quite name, something that felt both lost and perpetually out of reach. Then came the invitation, delivered by a man in a crisp suit and a polished hat, smelling of city streets rather than pine needles and campfire smoke. It was from William F. Buffalo Bill Cody, a name that resonated with the very essence of the vanishing West, a man who had, in his own way, become a living legend. He offered her a place in his Wild West show, a grand spectacle designed to bring the romance and danger of the frontier to eager audiences across the country. For a moment, a flicker of her old fire ignited. The idea of donning her buckskins, mounting a horse, and riding before cheering crowds, embodying the Calamity Jane of legend, held a certain allure, a chance to reclaim a piece of her fading identity. She arrived at the show's encampment, a bustling, chaotic world of canvas tents, painted backdrops, and the constant murmur of 1,000 voices. The air was thick with the scent of sawdust, horse sweat, and cheap perfume, a stark contrast to the clean, crisp air of the Black Hills. Cody greeted her with a theatrical flourish, his eyes twinkling with a showman's charm, and she found herself swept into a whirlwind of rehearsals and costume fittings. They wanted her to ride, to shoot, to tell tales of her exploits, to be the Calamity Jane that dime novels had created, a larger-than-life figure of daring and defiance. At first there was a thrill in it, a fleeting resurgence of her youthful bravado. She would ride into the arena, the roar of the crowd washing over her, the bright lights illuminating her weathered face, and for those few minutes, she was Calamity Jane, the fearless scout, the crack shot, the woman who rode with Wild Bill Hickok. She spoke of her adventures, embellishing them with the dramatic flair Cody encouraged, watching the wide-eyed faces of the audience, seeing their belief in the myth. Yet, with each performance, a hollowness began to grow within her, a quiet dissonance between the woman they saw and the woman she truly was. The buckskins felt like a costume, the horse beneath her a prop, the stories rehearsed lines rather than lived experiences. The dust of the arena was not the dust of a real trail, and the cheers of the crowd though exhilarating, felt strangely empty. One evening, after a particularly boisterous performance, she sat alone in her tent, the sounds of the show's after-party drifting in from afar. She ran a calloused hand over the worn leather of her saddle, a saddle that had carried her across countless miles of real wilderness, through scorching deserts and snow-covered mountains. She remembered the bite of the wind on her face, the scent of pine and sagebrush, the vast, silent majesty of a starlit prairie. Here, under the canvas, surrounded by manufactured excitement, she felt a profound sense of displacement. The freedom she had always craved, the untamed spirit that defined her, felt caged, reduced to a mere spectacle. She saw the other performers, many of whom were genuine cowboys, Native American riders, and sharpshooters, all playing roles, reenacting a past that was rapidly fading. They were preserving a memory, perhaps, but they were not living it. Martha Jane yearned for the authenticity of the open range, the quiet companionship of a campfire, the honest struggle against the elements. The staged gunfights and choreographed chases felt like a mockery of the real dangers she had faced, the real losses she had endured. She remembered the fear in her gut during an ambush, the ache in her heart after a friend's passing, the quiet satisfaction of a well-earned meal under a vast, indifferent sky. None of that could be replicated under the bright lights of an arena. One particularly cold morning, as the show packed up to move to another city, Martha Jane watched the sunrise paint the urban sky in muted grays and purples, so different from the vibrant, fiery dawns of the Black Hills. A deep, undeniable ache settled in her chest, a yearning for the scent of pine, the sound of a distant hawk, the feel of true wilderness beneath her boots. She realized then that the legend, the Calamity Jane of the dime novels and the Wild West show, was not her true self. Her true self was forged in the quiet moments of solitude, in the acts of kindness she had offered, in the fierce independence that had guided her through a life of hardship and adventure. She sought out Cody, her resolve firm. He listened with a practiced smile, understanding the restless spirit that chafed under the constraints of his show. He offered her more money, a bigger role, but she shook her head gently. "It ain't the money, Bill," she said, her voice rough with emotion. "It ain't even the glory. It's just, this ain't my West. My West, it's out there, still breathing, even if it's got fences now. I need to go back to where the wind remembers my name." Cody, a showman to his core, but also a man who understood the heart of the frontier, nodded slowly. "I reckon I understand, Jane," he said, his voice softer than usual. "The stage ain't for every wild bird. Some need the open sky." And so, Martha Jane Cannary, the legendary Calamity Jane, quietly slipped away from the spectacle, leaving behind the roar of the crowds and the manufactured dreams. She carried with her a small purse of earnings, a few worn possessions, and a renewed sense of purpose. Her journey back to the Black Hills was not a retreat, but a pilgrimage, a return to the landscapes that had shaped her, the mountains and valleys that held the echoes of her youth, the memories of her triumphs and her sorrows. The train ride was long, rattling her bones, but with each mile westward, a sense of peace began to settle over her. The air grew cleaner, the towns smaller, the horizons wider. When she finally stepped off the train in a small Dakota town, the scent of pine needles and damp earth filled her lungs, a familiar comfort that brought tears to her eyes. The Black Hills rose in the distance, dark and majestic, their peaks shrouded in mist, beckoning her home. She made her way back to Deadwood, the town that had been both a crucible and a sanctuary in her tumultuous life. It had changed, of course. The raw, desperate energy of the gold rush had softened, replaced by a more settled, if still rough-hewn prosperity. There were more brick buildings, fewer tents, and the streets, though still dusty, were a little less chaotic. Yet the spirit of the place, the resilience and the stubborn independence, remained. Martha Jane found a small cabin on the outskirts of town, nestled amongst the pines, far enough from the bustle to offer solitude, but close enough to feel connected. It was a simple dwelling, just a few rooms, but it felt more like home than any place she had ever known. She spent her days walking the familiar trails, her boots crunching on pine needles, the scent of resin and damp earth filling her senses. She knew these woods intimately, every ridge, every stream, every hidden glade. She saw the same majestic pines, the same granite outcroppings, the same clear, cold streams that had flowed through her youth. Sometimes she would stop by the local saloon, not for the revelry, but for the quiet camaraderie of a familiar face, a shared story. People recognized her, of course. The legend of Calamity Jane had preceded her, and her return only solidified her place in the town's lore. They would offer her a drink, a kind word, and she would sit by the fire, listening to the hum of conversation, the clinking of glasses, the distant, mournful cry of a coyote. She no longer sought the center of attention, content to be a quiet observer, a living testament to a bygone era. She found solace in the simple rhythms of life, in the quiet beauty of the changing seasons. She watched the spring wildflowers burst forth in vibrant hues, the summer sun dapple through the pine branches, the autumn leaves turn to fiery gold, and the winter snow blanket the hills in a pristine, hushed silence. Each season brought its own unique beauty, its own gentle wisdom. One crisp autumn afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Martha Jane sat on the porch of her cabin, a worn blanket draped over her shoulders. The air was cool and carried the faint scent of wood smoke from a distant chimney. She watched a hawk circle lazily overhead, its cry echoing through the valley, a sound that had been a constant companion throughout her life. She thought of her past, of the wild rides, the daring adventures, the friends she had loved and lost. She thought of Wild Bill, his quiet strength, his unwavering gaze, the gentle touch of his hand. The memories were no longer sharp stings of regret, but soft, cherished echoes, like the distant murmur of a familiar song. She had lived a life of contradictions, a woman who defied expectations, who carved her own path in a world that offered few such opportunities. She had been a scout, a bullwhacker, a storyteller, a mother, a friend, a legend. She had known hardship and loss, but also moments of profound joy and unwavering courage. The yearning for freedom, that fierce, unyielding desire that had driven her across the vast expanse of the West, had ultimately led her back to this quiet corner of the world, to a different kind of freedom, one found not in constant motion, but in peaceful acceptance. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long purple shadows across the hills. The stars began to emerge, one by one, pricking the darkening sky like scattered diamonds. Martha Jane looked up, her gaze sweeping across the familiar constellations, the same stars that had guided her through countless nights on the open prairie. She felt a profound sense of peace, a quiet understanding that her journey, with all its twists and turns, its triumphs and its heartaches, had brought her exactly where she was meant to be. The legend of Calamity Jane would live on, whispered around campfires and printed in dime novels. But the woman, Martha Jane Cannary, had found her gentle sunset, her quiet wisdom, in the embrace of the Black Hills, a place where the wind still remembered her name, and the vast, star-filled sky held the silent whispers of a life truly lived. She closed her eyes, the cool night air caressing her face, and listened to the peaceful silence of the mountains, a silence that spoke of home, of belonging, and of a life, finally, at rest. The peaceful silence of the mountains, a silence that spoke of home, of belonging, and of a life finally at rest, did not, however, hold Martha Jane Cannary for long. The relentless currents of time, much like the churning waters of the Missouri River she had known in her youth, continued their inexorable flow, carrying her further from the wild, untamed freedom she had so fiercely embraced. The quiet wisdom she had glimpsed in the embrace of the Black Hills proved to be a fleeting comfort, a brief respite before the long, weary journey of her final years truly began. The frontier, once a boundless expanse promising endless reinvention, was slowly, irrevocably vanishing, its wild heart being tamed by railroads, fences, and the relentless march of civilization. Martha Jane, a creature of that vanishing world, found herself increasingly adrift, a living relic in a landscape that no longer understood her particular brand of fierce independence. Her body, once a testament to resilience and endurance, began to betray her. The years of riding hard, sleeping under open skies, the countless nights spent in the smoky haze of saloons, and the biting cold of winter camps had etched their toll deep into her bones and spirit. The robust health that had allowed her to outride, outshoot, and outlast many a man slowly gave way to a persistent weariness, a deep-seated ache that no amount of whiskey could truly numb. Her once sharp eyes, which had scanned distant horizons for danger and opportunity, now often held a shadowed, distant look, reflecting the ghosts of adventures past and the quiet anxieties of a present that offered little solace. The rough buckskins and worn denim, once a symbol of her defiant spirit, now seemed to hang more heavily on her frame, a uniform of a life that was slowly fading. She drifted from town to town, a familiar, if somewhat faded figure, her reputation preceding her like a dusty wind. In Deadwood, where her legend had been forged in the crucible of gold rush fever, she was still recognized, though often with a mix of reverence and pity. The boisterous, gold-flecked streets she had once known had softened, growing more sedate, more respectable, and less tolerant of her untamed ways. The saloons that had once welcomed her with boisterous cheers now sometimes regarded her with a wary eye, her presence a reminder of a wilder, less predictable past that many were eager to forget. She found herself relying more and more on the kindness of strangers, on the lingering goodwill of old acquaintances who remembered the quick wit, the generous spirit, and the surprising tenderness that lay beneath her famously gruff exterior. Sometimes, a saloon owner, remembering a past favor or a particularly entertaining story, would offer her a warm meal and a place to sleep by the stove, a small comfort against the encroaching chill of her declining fortunes. Her stories, once told with such vibrant energy and embellishment, now carried a heavier weight, tinged with a palpable sense of loss. She would recount tales of riding with Wild Bill, of scouting for Custer, of daring rescues and narrow escapes, her voice growing hoarse, her gestures less expansive. Yet, even in her weariness, the spark of the storyteller remained, a flicker of the woman who had captivated audiences and shaped her own myth. She spoke of the vast plains under an endless sky, of the scent of pine needles in the Black Hills, of the roar of a stampede and the quiet camaraderie of a campfire. These memories were her most precious possessions, a tapestry woven from the threads of a life lived fully, fiercely, and without compromise. They were her truth, even if the world around her increasingly preferred a more sanitized, less complicated version of history. One blustery autumn evening, as the first snowflakes began to dance in the crisp air, Martha Jane found herself in the small, unassuming town of Terry, nestled just a few miles from Deadwood. The air, thin and sharp, carried the scent of wood smoke and damp earth, a familiar aroma that stirred a deep, melancholic longing within her. She had come seeking shelter, her body racked by persistent cough that had settled deep in her chest, a cruel companion that stole her breath and her strength.
A kind woman, Mrs. Emma W. Brophy, the proprietor of the Callaway Hotel, recognized the legendary figure standing on her porch, her shoulders hunched against the cold, her eyes holding a profound weariness. Without a word, Mrs. Brophy ushered her inside, offering her a warm room, a soft bed, and a cup of hot tea, a simple act of human compassion that Martha Jane accepted with a grateful, if unaccustomed, humility. The days that followed blurred into a hazy succession of feverish dreams and moments of quiet lucidity. Martha Jane lay in the soft bed, the unfamiliar luxury of clean sheets, a stark contrast to the hard ground and rough blankets she had known for so long. She saw the faces of those she had loved and lost, her parents, whose memory had driven her westward, Wild Bill Hickok, his piercing blue eyes and quiet strength, a constant, enduring presence in her mind, her daughter, Janie, a phantom child whose absence was a wound that never truly healed. She heard the distant thrum of wagon wheels, the faint strains of a piano from a faraway saloon, the whisper of the wind through the eaves, each sound a faint echo of the vibrant, tumultuous life she had led. Her strength ebbed away with each passing day, like a river slowly drying under a relentless sun. The cough grew harsher, her breath shallower, each inhalation a struggle. Yet, even in her final hours, a flicker of her indomitable spirit remained. She spoke in hushed tones, her voice raspy, of her desire to be buried next to Wild Bill, a wish that held a profound significance for her. It was not merely a romantic yearning, though a deep affection undoubtedly lingered, but a testament to a shared understanding, a bond forged in the crucible of the wild frontier, a recognition of two souls who had navigated the same treacherous currents of fame and solitude. To lie beside him in the quiet earth of Mount Moriah would be to finally find a place of belonging, a final enduring connection in a life often marked by profound loneliness. On the first day of August, in the year 1903, as the summer sun cast long shadows across the Black Hills, Martha Jane Cannary, known to the world as Calamity Jane, drew her last breath. The room was quiet, save for the gentle ticking of a clock and the soft murmur of Mrs. Brophy's prayers. The fierce, untamed spirit that had defied convention, ridden with legends, had finally found its quiet resting place and carved its own path across the vast American West, finally found its peace. Her journey had ended not in a blaze of glory, but in the quiet dignity of a small hotel room, surrounded by the simple kindness of strangers. News of her passing spread quickly through the mining camps and towns, carried by telegraph wires and whispered among the dusty trails. The legend, which she had so meticulously crafted and fiercely defended throughout her life, now took on a life of its own, unfettered by the frailties of her human form. The people of Deadwood, remembering the wild, generous, and often contradictory woman who had walked among them, honored her final wish. They prepared her for burial, dressing her not in the buckskins she had worn, but in a simple, dignified dress, a final poignant nod to the woman beneath the legend. Her funeral was a spectacle, a testament to the enduring power of her myth. A long procession wound its way up the winding path to Mount Moriah Cemetery. The dusty road lined with curious onlookers and genuine mourners. Miners, gamblers, saloon keepers, and respectable townsfolk all came to pay their respects to the woman who had embodied so much of the frontier spirit. The air was still, heavy with the scent of pine and the unspoken weight of history. As her coffin was lowered into the earth, beside the grave of Wild Bill Hickok, a profound silence fell over the assembled crowd.
It was a silence that spoke not only of grief, but of the passing of an era, the closing chapter of a wild, untamed world. Beneath the western stars, in the hallowed ground of Mount Moriah, Martha Jane found her final resting place. The wind, which had once carried her shouts of defiance and her boisterous laughter across the plains, now whispered softly through the pine trees that stood sentinel over her graves. Her life, a tumultuous tapestry woven with threads of adventure, hardship, compassion, and fierce independence, had come to its peaceful conclusion. She had sought freedom and identity in a world that offered few roles for women outside domesticity, and she had, in her own extraordinary way, achieved it. She had faced constant challenges of survival, societal judgment, and personal loss, transforming from a restless, myth-making adventurer into a figure of enduring legend. Grappling with the loneliness of her chosen path, but ultimately finding a form of peace in her unique legacy. Her story, however, did not end with her burial. It continued to live on, whispered around campfires, recounted in dime novels, and passed down through generations. She became an archetype, a symbol of the untamed spirit of the American West, a woman who dared to live on her own terms, defying societal expectations and forging a path where none had existed. The contradictions of her life, the hard-drinking frontierswoman with a tender heart, the rough-and-tumble scout who nursed the sick, the myth-maker who yearned for a quiet home, only deepened her allure, making her a figure of endless fascination. As the years turned into decades and the frontier receded further into memory, the legend of Calamity Jane continued to grow, burnished by time and the collective imagination. Her name became synonymous with courage, resilience, and a fierce, untamed spirit. She was a reminder of a time when the land was vast and wild, and the possibilities seemed endless. A time when individuals could, through sheer force of will, carve out their own destinies. Now, as the moon climbs high above the Black Hills, casting a silver glow over the silent landscape, one can almost hear the faint echo of a horse's hooves on a distant trail, the whisper of a campfire story carried on the wind. The air is still, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth, a timeless aroma that has permeated these mountains for centuries. The stars, ancient and unblinking, glitter in the velvet expanse of the night sky, bearing silent witness to the enduring legacy of those who dared to dream, to live, and to love in the wild heart of the American West. Beneath those same western stars, in the quiet earth of Mount Moriah, Martha Jane Cannary rests, her journey complete. The wind sighs gently through the tall pines, a lullaby for the legendary woman who found her freedom in the vastness of the frontier, and her final peace in the embrace of the enduring land. The world, for a moment, seems to hold its breath, listening to the silent stories whispered by the night, stories of courage, of resilience, and of a life, finally, at rest beneath the vast, star-filled sky. The soft light of dawn, painting the eastern sky in hues of rose and gold, began to chase away the lingering shadows that clung to the rugged peaks surrounding Deadwood Gulch, revealing the nascent town stirring to life, a cacophony of distant hammers and the faint jingle of harnesses already breaking the morning stillness. In a small, unassuming cabin nestled on the outskirts, Dora Dufran, her hands calloused but nimble, meticulously polished a silver locket, its surface reflecting the flickering lamplight that still burned low in the room, a testament to her early rising and the quiet industry that defined her days. She thought of Martha Jane often, especially in these quiet hours before the bustle began, remembering the fierce spirit and the surprising tenderness that lay beneath the rough exterior, a tenderness Dora had glimpsed in moments shared over coffee or a shared worry about the unpredictable nature of the frontier. The scent of pine resin and damp earth, carried on the cool morning breeze, drifted through the open window, mingling with the faint aroma of brewing coffee, creating a comforting blend that spoke of home, however temporary, in this wild land. Miles away, across the undulating plains where buffalo once roamed in thundering herds, James Butler Hickok, a man whose reputation preceded him like a dust storm, rode alone, his gaze sweeping the horizon with unpracticed intensity that missed nothing, even as his thoughts drifted to the past, to the faces of those he had known, and to the ever-present shadow of the legend he had become. The sun, now a brilliant orb ascending above the distant bluffs, cast long, distorted shadows of his horse and himself across the prairie grasses, which shimmered with dew and whispered secrets in the gentle wind, a vast, open expanse that both promised freedom and amplified the profound solitude of his journey. He carried with him not only his iconic pistols, pearl-handled and well-worn, but also the weight of countless encounters, the echoes of gunshots, and the silent pleas of those who had sought his protection or his judgment, a burden that settled deep in his bones despite the outward calm he always maintained. The rhythmic creak of his saddle leather and a steady thud of his horse's hooves against the dusty trail were the only sounds accompanying him, a constant hypnotic rhythm that allowed his mind to wander through the labyrinthine corridors of memory, searching for a peace that often eluded him in the waking world. Meanwhile, Reverend Henry Weston Smith, a man of God whose gentle demeanor belied an iron will, walked the rough-hewn streets of Deadwood, his worn Bible clutched in one hand, his gaze thoughtful as he observed the burgeoning chaos of the mining camp, a place where fortunes were made and lost with bewildering speed, and where the lines between good and evil often blurred into an indistinguishable haze. He paused by a makeshift saloon, the raucous laughter and tinny piano music already spilling out into the morning air, and offered a silent prayer for the souls within, for the lost and the lonely, for those who sought solace in fleeting pleasures, and for the desperate who clung to the hope of striking it rich. The air, thick with the smell of sawdust, stale whiskey, and the faint metallic tang of newly unearthed ore, pressed in around him, a stark contrast to the clean mountain air he had breathed during his solitary walks. Yet he found a strange beauty in the raw vitality of the place, a testament to humanity's relentless drive to forge a life, however precarious, in the wilderness. He often thought of the quiet dignity of the pine forests, of the steadfastness of the granite peaks, and wondered if the human spirit, too, could find such enduring strength amidst the transient nature of their lives on this unforgiving frontier. One particularly sweltering afternoon, the kind where the air hung heavy and still, promising a distant thunderstorm, Dora found herself seated on the porch of her establishment, a rare moment of repose, watching a lone prospector slowly make his way up the gulch, his pickaxe glinting in the harsh sunlight, a silent testament to the relentless pursuit of elusive riches. She remembered a conversation with Martha Jane late one night when the town had finally quieted, about the true cost of living on the edge, the constant weighing of freedom against security, and the peculiar loneliness that could settle upon even the most boisterous of souls. Martha had spoken of the vast, indifferent beauty of the plains, of riding for days with only the wind for company, and of the profound sense of belonging she sometimes found in the company of her horses, a connection deeper than many human bonds. Dora, who had always preferred the relative stability of a roof over her head and the familiar faces of her girls, had listened with a quiet understanding, recognizing the fierce independence that drove Martha, even as she sometimes longed for a softer, less demanding existence for her friend. The distant rumble of thunder, a low growl from beyond the hills, finally broke the oppressive stillness, a reminder of the untamed power that lay just beyond the town's fragile boundaries, echoing the untamed spirit of the people who called this place home. As the days bled into weeks, and the vibrant colors of summer began to yield to the golden hues of autumn, Wild Bill Hickok, having ridden countless miles across the Dakota plains, eventually found himself drawn to the bustling, often lawless energy of Deadwood, a magnet for both opportunity and danger, a place where his reputation would undoubtedly precede him. He rode into town on a dusty afternoon, the sun low in the western sky, casting long, dramatic shadows across the main street, which was already teeming with a motley collection of miners, gamblers, soiled doves, and merchants, their faces etched with the stories of their arduous journeys and their desperate hopes. The cacophony of sounds, the clatter of wagons, the shouts of teamsters, the incessant hammering from new construction, and the distant strains of a banjo assaulted his ears, a stark contrast to the profound silence of the open prairie he had just left behind. Yet there was a peculiar allure to the raw, untamed vitality of the place. He dismounted in front of the Grand Central Hotel, his movements fluid and economical, his eyes scanning the street with a practiced vigilance, taking in every detail, every potential threat, every fleeting expression on the faces of those who watched him with a mixture of awe and apprehension. The air, thick with the smell of dust, pine smoke, and the faint, sweet scent of newly sawn lumber, felt heavy and expectant, as if the very atmosphere of Deadwood held its breath, anticipating the next chapter in the unfolding drama of the West, a drama in which he, whether he wished it or not, was destined to play a pivotal role. Reverend Smith, witnessing Hickok's arrival from a distance, felt a familiar pang of concern, for he understood that while men like Hickok brought a certain order, however violent, to the chaotic frontier, they also attracted trouble like moths to a flame, often leaving a trail of sorrow and bloodshed in their wake. He had heard the tales of Hickok's prowess with a gun, of his legendary courage and his unwavering sense of justice. But he also knew the stories of the lives cut short, the families shattered, and the deep, abiding grief that lingered long after the smoke had cleared. The Reverend, a man who sought to bring peace and spiritual solace to a community often consumed by greed and vice, saw in Hickok not just a famous gunslinger, but a soul burdened by the choices he had made. A man living under the immense pressure of his own myth, and he wondered if even the strongest of men could ever truly escape the consequences of their past. He offered a silent prayer, not for Hickok's safety, but for his soul, for the possibility of redemption in a world that rarely offered second chances, and for the fragile peace of Deadwood, which now felt more precarious than ever with the arrival of such a formidable figure. Later that evening, as the stars began to prickle through the darkening sky above Deadwood, casting a soft, ethereal glow upon the rough-hewn buildings, Wild Bill found himself in a quiet corner of the Gem Theatre, a place that, despite its name, was more of a saloon and variety hall, its air thick with tobacco smoke and the boisterous energy of the evening crowd. He sat at a small table, nursing a whiskey, his back to the wall, his keen eyes observing the swirling tableau of humanity around him, a silent sentinel amidst the raucous laughter and the clinking of glasses, a man perpetually on guard. He noticed Dora Dufran across the room, her presence a beacon of quiet strength amidst the chaos, her gaze occasionally sweeping the room with an air of proprietorship and a subtle, almost imperceptible wariness that spoke of the heavy responsibilities she carried. He had known Dora for some time, their paths having crossed in various frontier towns, and he respected her shrewdness, her resilience, and the surprising kindness she extended to those in her employ, a kindness often lacking in this harsh world. A quiet moment passed between them, a silent acknowledgement across the smoky room, a shared understanding of the precarious nature of their lives, of the constant dance between survival and fleeting moments of peace. Dora, catching his eye, offered a small, knowing smile, a gesture of recognition, and perhaps a touch of weary camaraderie, before turning her attention back to a young woman who was nervously adjusting her elaborate feathered hat, offering a reassuring word and a gentle pat on the shoulder. Wild Bill, in turn, offered a slight nod, his expression unreadable, a man who rarely betrayed his inner thoughts, yet in that brief exchange, a silent conversation had taken place, a testament to the unspoken bonds forged between those who navigated the treacherous currents of the American West. The distant howl of a coyote, a mournful cry carried on the night wind from the surrounding hills, momentarily pierced the din of the saloon, a stark reminder of the wildness that lay just beyond the flimsy walls of civilization, a wildness that both defined and threatened their very existence. The following morning, a crisp autumn chill permeated the air, carrying the scent of wood smoke and damp earth through the narrow streets of Deadwood, as Reverend Smith embarked on one of his customary journeys, a solitary pilgrimage to minister to the isolated mining camps scattered throughout the rugged Black Hills. He traveled on foot, his sturdy boots crunching on the gravelly trail, his worn satchel containing his Bible, a few medical supplies, and a meager ration of dried meat and hardtack, a testament to his unwavering dedication and his simple, unadorned life. The path wound its way through dense pine forests, their needles forming a soft, fragrant carpet beneath his feet, and along the banks of rushing streams, their waters crystal clear and icy cold, reflecting the brilliant blue of the morning sky. He found solace in the profound silence of the wilderness, broken only by the chirping of unseen birds and the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze, a stark contrast to the clamor and moral ambiguity of Deadwood, a place where he often felt his faith was tested to its very limits. As he walked, his mind drifted to the stories he had heard, the desperate pleas for spiritual guidance, the quiet confessions of men hardened by their relentless pursuit of gold, and the profound loneliness that often settled upon those who chose to live in such remote and unforgiving landscapes. He thought of Martha Jane, her restless spirit, her capacity for both fierce loyalty and impulsive recklessness, and he wondered if she had ever truly found the peace she sought in life, or if it had only come to her in the quiet embrace of the earth. He also pondered the arrival of Wild Bill Hickok, a man whose presence seemed to cast a long, complicated shadow over the nascent community, and he prayed for wisdom, for guidance, and for the strength to navigate the moral complexities that such a figure inevitably brought to Deadwood. The sun, now higher in the sky, dappled through the canopy of pines, painting shifting patterns of light and shadow on the forest floor, creating an ethereal beauty that momentarily lifted his spirits, reminding him of the enduring grace that could be found even in the most desolate of places, a grace he tirelessly sought to share with the lost souls of the Black Hills. Days later, after a particularly arduous trek through a newly fallen snow that blanketed the Black Hills in a pristine, dazzling white, Reverend Smith arrived at a small, isolated mining camp, a cluster of crude cabins huddled together against the biting wind, where the men, their faces grimed with coal dust and etched with fatigue, greeted him with a mixture of surprise and genuine relief. He spent hours listening to their woes, offering words of comfort and spiritual guidance, and sharing the meager contents of his satchel, his presence a beacon of compassion in a world often devoid of such gentle mercies. The air inside the small, smoky cabin where he held his impromptu service was thick with the scent of pine smoke and unwashed bodies. Yet the miners listened with rapt attention, their hardened faces softened by the simple message of hope and redemption he offered, a message that resonated deeply in the quiet desperation of their lives. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in fiery oranges and deep purples. Reverend Smith, exhausted but spiritually invigorated, prepared for his journey back to Deadwood, knowing that his work was far from over, that the spiritual needs of this wild frontier were as vast and as endless as the towering mountains themselves. He looked out at the snow-covered landscape, the silence profound and unbroken, save for the distant howl of a wolf, and felt a deep sense of purpose, a quiet resolve to continue his tireless efforts to bring light into the shadows, to offer solace in the face of hardship, and to remind these rugged individuals of the enduring power of faith and the unwavering presence of a benevolent spirit. The stars, already beginning to emerge in the twilight sky, glittered with an unparalleled brilliance, ancient and unblinking witnesses to the quiet heroism of a man who, armed only with his faith and his compassion, sought to mend the broken souls of the American West. Back in Deadwood, the town continued its relentless, often chaotic expansion, the sounds of hammers and saws echoing through the gulch from dawn until dusk, transforming the raw wilderness into a burgeoning settlement, a testament to the unyielding human desire for prosperity and community, however rough-hewn. Dora Dufran, ever the astute businesswoman, oversaw the construction of an addition to her establishment, a new wing that would offer more rooms, and she hoped a touch more refinement, a subtle nod to the growing expectations of a town that was slowly shedding its initial lawless veneer. She supervised the carpenters with a keen eye, her voice firm but fair, ensuring that the work was done to her exacting standards, for she understood that in a place where reputations were everything, quality and reliability were paramount, even in the most unexpected of professions. One evening, as the last rays of sunlight faded from the peaks, leaving the gulch bathed in a soft, ethereal twilight, Dora found herself sharing a quiet meal with Wild Bill Hickok at a secluded table in her dining room, the clatter of silverware and the murmur of conversation from other patrons providing a gentle backdrop to their subdued exchange. He spoke little, as was his custom, but his eyes, sharp and intelligent, missed nothing, and Dora, accustomed to reading unspoken cues, sensed a weariness in him, a profound solitude that even his legendary composure could not entirely mask. They spoke of the changing landscape of the West, of the inexorable march of civilization, and of the inevitable fading of the wild frontier, a topic that brought a flicker of melancholy to Hickok's usually impassive face, for he was a man intrinsically linked to the untamed spirit of the land. Dora, in a rare moment of introspection, shared a memory of Martha Jane, of a time when they had sat beneath a vast, star-filled sky, far from the clamor of any town. And Martha had spoken of the stars as ancient storytellers, each one holding the silent tales of countless lives lived and lost on the plains below. She described Martha's fierce love for the wild, her yearning for a freedom that often bordered on recklessness, and the deep, almost childlike wonder she possessed for the raw beauty of the natural world, a side of Calamity Jane that few ever truly witnessed. Wild Bill listened intently, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the window, a faint, almost imperceptible softening around his eyes, for he too had seen that wild wonder in Martha, that untamed spirit that mirrored his own in unexpected ways, and he understood the profound sense of loss that Dora, and indeed many others, felt in her absence. The flickering lamplight cast long, dancing shadows across the room, creating an intimate atmosphere that encouraged such quiet confidences, a brief respite from the relentless demands of their lives, a shared moment of reflection on the enduring legacies of those who dared to live fully in the heart of the American West. The quiet hum of the saloon, usually a cacophony of boisterous laughter and clinking glasses, had settled into a more subdued murmur as the night deepened, leaving Dora and Wild Bill in their shared contemplation, the weight of memory hanging heavy in the air between them. Soon, the first faint hints of dawn would paint the eastern sky, signaling the time for Wild Bill to embark on his journey north, away from the bustling, often perilous streets of Deadwood, towards the quieter, pine-scented solitude of the hills, where the whispers of the wind through the tall trees offered a different kind of solace. He thought of the endless stretch of prairie he would soon traverse, the vast expanse of land that seemed to swallow up worries and fears, leaving only the stark beauty of the horizon and the rhythmic thud of his horse's hooves for company, a familiar comfort for a man who had known much solitude. The scent of pine and damp earth, carried on the cool morning breeze, promised a temporary reprieve from the dusty clamor of the mining camps, a chance to simply be, far from the watchful eyes and the ever-present dangers that lurk in every shadow of civilization's encroaching reach.